A prison escape during Britain's worst blizzard unleashed 3 days of terror at Pottery Cottage. 4 murdered by an escaped prisoner while police searched just 200 yards away. In the harsh winter of 1977, as the Peak District disappeared under the heaviest snowfall in 50 years, a violent criminal named William Hughes escaped custody and found shelter at Pottery Cottage. What followed was one of Britain's most disturbing hostage situations: 3 days of psychological manipulation, sexual assault, and ultimately murder. While Hughes played card games with his remaining captives, he had already killed 2 family members, maintaining an elaborate deception that they were still alive. The tragedy exposed fatal flaws in Britain's criminal justice system and culminated in a desperate police standoff that would change hostage response tactics forever. This is the story of systemic failures, unimaginable cruelty, and a final act of heroism that saved the sole survivor from an axe-wielding killer. Before we continue with this chilling true crime case, I want to welcome you to X by X Confidential, where we dive deep into the forgotten crimes that shaped our justice system. Now, let's return to the tragic events that unfolded in January 1977. In the quiet hills of Derbyshire, England, a picturesque stone building called Pottery Cottage stood against the winter landscape. No one could have predicted the horror that would unfold there in January 1977. William Thomas Hughes was born on August 8, 1946, in Preston, Lancashire. The first of 6 children, Hughes showed little interest in education. His academic performance was poor, and he gravitated toward antisocial behavior from a young age. At just 14, Hughes was arrested for theft, the first of what would become 21 criminal charges throughout his lifetime. After leaving school at 15, Hughes failed to hold down steady employment. His escalating criminal behavior led to stints in approved school, then borstal, and eventually prison. By 1966, he received the first of multiple prison sentences. His violent tendencies earned him the nickname Mad Billy among those who knew him. In 1972, Hughes married Jean Nadine, a Blackpool native and mother of 1. Hughes had proposed to her while incarcerated at HMP Walton. The couple settled near Blackpool's Golden Mile and had a daughter, Nicola, born on August 6, 1972. Though their relationship started harmoniously, it quickly deteriorated with neglect, abuse, and infidelity. The family moved frequently, partly due to Hughes's refusal to pay rent. In 1973, Hughes received a 3.5-year sentence for assaulting 4 police officers. Following his release in early 1976, he abandoned his wife and child in March of that year and moved to Chesterfield with his girlfriend, Teresa O'Doherty. On August 21, 1976, Hughes followed a young couple he had met at a nightclub to a local park. There he beat the man unconscious with a brick before dragging the woman to a nearby riverbank where he raped her at knife point. Following a public appeal and an anonymous tip, police arrested Hughes on August 27. He was charged and remanded to HMP Leicester. Despite his violent history, Hughes was categorized as a Category B inmate, deemed non-dangerous and a low escape risk. This critical error occurred because police had provided minimal information about Hughes to the prison, and prison service headquarters failed to furnish a comprehensive record of his previous convictions and custodial history. Working in the prison kitchen, Hughes stole a 7.5-inch boning knife on December 3, 1976. He managed to hide it in a tear he had carved in his mattress, evading subsequent searches. A report stating Hughes was of a violent nature and might attempt to escape did not arrive at HMP Leicester until after the events that would soon unfold. Meanwhile, at Pottery Cottage in Eastmoor near Chesterfield, lived a family unaware of the danger approaching. Arthur Minton, 72, and his wife Amy, 67, shared the converted 18th-century pottery barn with their daughter Gillian Moran, 38, her husband Richard Moran, 41, and their adopted 10-year-old daughter Sarah. The Mintons had moved from the West Midlands after Arthur's retirement from running a grocery shop. Richard worked as a sales director for a plastics company, while Gillian was a secretary for an accounting firm. The family had converted the property into 3 living units in October 1969, renaming it Pottery Cottage. They occupied one end, while schoolteachers Leonard and Joyce Newman lived at the other end. The central section remained unoccupied. January 12, 1977. On the morning of January 12, 1977, William Hughes made a threatening phone call to his ex-girlfriend Teresa O'Doherty from HMP Leicester. When O'Doherty informed Hughes their relationship was over and refused to appear as a character witness at his upcoming court appearance, he became enraged, shouting, "You fucking bitch! You'd better lock your fucking doors," before calmly returning to his kitchen duties. Later that morning, Hughes was transported from prison to appear at Chesterfield Magistrates Court for a scheduled remand hearing related to the rape charges. He was escorted by prison officers Donald Sprintall and Kenneth Simmons in a taxi driven by David Reynolds. Following standard procedure, Hughes was frisked and handcuffed to Officer Simmons, leaving one hand free. Weather conditions were poor that day. Heavy snow had fallen across the region, hindering traffic along the 55-mile route. Initially, Hughes engaged in small talk with the officers. Between junctions 25 and 26 of the M1 motorway, Hughes insisted he needed to use the bathroom. The officers allowed the vehicle to pull into a service station, where Hughes discreetly retrieved the stolen boning knife he had hidden on his person before being handcuffed again. Shortly after the journey resumed, Hughes launched his attack. He first stabbed Officer Sprintall in the back of the neck, narrowly missing his spine. As Sprintall later recalled, "The blow hit me with such force I thought we had been hit from behind by a lorry." Hughes then turned on Simmons, slashing him across the jaw and hand. After incapacitating both officers, Hughes held the knife to Sprintall's throat and forced him to provide the handcuff keys. With both officers injured, Hughes forced taxi driver David Reynolds to continue driving at knife point along the A617, before eventually dumping all 3 men at the roadside and stealing the vehicle. Hughes drove only a short distance before crashing the taxi into a wall along the B5057 near Chatsworth House. He fled on foot onto Beeley Moor in blizzard conditions. Police were notified of Hughes's escape around 10 a.m., and the crashed taxi was located within the hour. Chief Inspector Peter Howes led the immediate search, but police dogs could not pick up a scent due to the heavy snowfall, which had already concealed any footprints. A search radius was established around isolated properties, farms, and outbuildings, with 256 locations checked in the first few hours. Investigators believed Hughes would likely head toward Beeley, aiming to reach the A6 road. They considered it improbable that he would attempt to cross the vast open moors in such treacherous weather. However, Hughes did exactly that, trekking over 4 miles of exposed moorland during a fierce blizzard. After approximately 2 hours, he reached Baslow Road in Eastmoor, close to the A619. One of the first buildings he encountered was Pottery Cottage. January 12 to March 14, 1977. Arthur and Amy Minton were at home when Hughes entered through their back door, armed with 2 axes he had taken from their shed. He informed the elderly couple that he was on the run from police after stabbing 2 prison officers and needed to hide until nightfall. Initially, Hughes assured them he would not harm them if they cooperated. Around 3 p.m., Gillian Moran arrived home, followed 30 minutes later by her 10-year-old daughter Sarah, who had returned from school. To prevent frightening her daughter, Gillian told Sarah that Hughes was a stranded motorist waiting for his car to be repaired. At first, the adults made small talk over coffee, while Sarah sat on the floor sewing. Later, the child and her grandfather went to watch television in the annex. In a subsequent witness statement, Gillian described Hughes's initial behavior as calm, noting, "Up to this time, Hughes's manner was friendly. However, he grew increasingly agitated as he awaited Richard's return." Richard Moran arrived home from a business meeting in Birmingham just after 6 p.m. to find Hughes holding a boning knife to his wife's throat. Hughes forced Richard to the floor, binding his hands and legs with flecks cut from a vacuum cleaner and washing line. He then tied up Gillian and Amy. Hearing Amy's distress, Arthur and Sarah came from the annex. Both confronted Hughes, with Arthur shouting for him to leave the family alone, as Sarah blurted, "Don't you dare hurt my mummy and daddy! Don't you dare!" Hughes threw Arthur to the ground, dragged the resisting pensioner across the floor, and placed him in an armchair where he bound him, while Sarah sat terrified on the floor. Despite his earlier assurances, Hughes gagged all the adults and isolated them in separate rooms. He took Sarah to her grandparents' bedroom. All 5 hostages spent the first night bound and gagged in different rooms. Gillian in her marital bedroom, Amy in Sarah's bedroom, Richard in a spare room, Sarah in her grandparents' bedroom, and Arthur in the downstairs lounge. During the evening, Gillian heard sounds of a disturbance from the lounge and realized her father was being beaten. Hughes later made tea for his hostages, holding the cup for Gillian while she drank before sexually assaulting her. He then spent the rest of the night talking to Richard in an adjacent room, boasting about his criminal past, as if he'd met Richard in a pub. That night, the Peak District experienced its heaviest snowfall in over 50 years. Many roads were cut off, with more blizzard conditions forecast. The following morning, January 13th, a local authority vehicle arrived to empty the property's septic tank. Hughes directed Gillian to greet the workers after warning her to deal with them and act normal. Briefly, Gillian noticed her father sitting motionless in the same armchair as the night before, covered with a suede coat. When she inquired, Hughes claimed Arthur was asleep, and he had covered him with the coat to keep him warm. Under Hughes's instructions, Gillian phoned her employer and Sarah's school, claiming they were both sick. When she asked about Sarah's whereabouts, Hughes said the child was asleep in the annex. Richard was forced to call his workplace with a similar illness excuse. Hughes then ordered Gillian to drive to Chesterfield to purchase newspapers and cigarettes and check for roadblocks, warning her, "I've got your family here, Gil, don't do anything stupid." Upon her return, Gillian noticed her father was no longer in the armchair. Hughes claimed he had moved him to the bedroom. Throughout the day, Gillian prepared meals for everyone. Hughes took plates of food to where he said Arthur and Sarah were, apparently attempting to convince the 3 known living hostages that the other 2 were unharmed. When Gillian asked why Sarah hadn't requested her comfort towel or small elephant teddy she always slept with, Hughes simply shrugged and said she just hasn't, before agreeing to take the items to her. He later claimed Sarah was really pleased to see them, but continued to forbid Gillian from seeing her daughter. After assuring his hostages he would leave that evening, Hughes untied them and suggested playing cards. They played several games of gin rummy while drinking whiskey. Later, Hughes briefly left the property with Richard and Gillian to test Richard's Chrysler 180, which he planned to use for his escape. He also took Gillian alone to Sutton in Ashfield in the early hours, claiming he needed to collect money owed to him by a friend. Due to continued heavy snowfall and treacherous driving conditions, Hughes remained at Pottery Cottage for a second night. When Gillian again requested to see her daughter, Hughes became visibly tense, frightening her into silence. By January 13th, the police search had expanded, with over 200 officers searching at any given time, and 2 British Army helicopters deployed, but quickly grounded due to weather conditions. The search remained focused between the crash taxi and the A6 road, still missing Pottery Cottage by about 200 yards. January 14, 1977. On the morning of January 14, Hughes ordered Gillian to prepare breakfast for everyone, again taking food to Arthur and Sarah to maintain the deception. He then told Richard and Gillian he needed supplies for his escape and ordered them to drive to Chesterfield to purchase food, cigarettes, a camping gas stove, and fuel. He handed Gillian £25 he had stolen from them earlier, saying, "While you're out, buy a nice present for Sarah." By this point, all 3 surviving hostages were near nervous collapse. During their journey, Richard tried to convince Gillian they should go to the police, but fearing for their family still at the house, she sternly refused. They purchased everything Hughes requested and returned to Pottery Cottage. Hughes spent the afternoon preparing to leave, continuing the charade of taking food to Sarah and Arthur and relaying fabricated conversations with Sarah to Gillian. Around 6 p.m., Hughes announced he needed more money for his escape and asked Richard if cash was stored at his workplace. Learning there was, Hughes forced the Morans to drive him to Brett Plastics, where he stole approximately £210 from wage packets and petty cash. Back at Pottery Cottage, Hughes bound Richard, packed supplies into the Chrysler, and announced he was leaving with Gillian as a hostage, promising to release her once they were safely away. After departing, Hughes insisted on returning to the house, claiming he had forgotten a map. He entered alone and fatally stabbed both Richard and Amy. When he returned to the car, it failed to start. Furious and panicked, Hughes ordered Gillian to ask neighbors for help. She approached Leonard and Joyce Newman, who quickly sensed something was wrong. In a croaking voice, Gillian said, "Len, for God's sake, help us." The Newmans immediately drove to the nearest phone box to alert police. As Hughes berated Gillian for warning the neighbors, a horrific sight appeared. Amy Minton, fatally wounded and covered in blood, had climbed through a window Hughes had opened and was staggering toward them. She collapsed in the snow before reaching the car. Gillian later recalled, "I couldn't believe it." She staggered very slowly towards the car. "I could see Mum lying on her back in the snow. I was petrified. I was at my wits' end." Hughes dragged Gillian from the car, saying they would have to make a run for it. They reached the home of another neighbor, mechanic Ronald Frost, whom Hughes asked to tow the vehicle. Understanding Gillian was being held captive, Frost deliberately prolonged the process while his wife contacted police. Eventually, Frost got the Chrysler started, and Hughes sped away toward Baslow. Police, alerted by the Newmans, deployed officers and marksmen to strategic locations around the area. Officers arriving at Pottery Cottage found Amy Minton's body in the snow, and subsequently discovered the bodies of Richard and Sarah Moran and Arthur Minton inside. All had died from multiple stab wounds to the throat and chest. Evidence suggested Arthur and Sarah had likely been murdered on the first night of captivity, despite Hughes's elaborate charade. The Chrysler was spotted driving at high speed along the A619, leading to a multiple-car police chase across Derbyshire and into Cheshire. At one point, an unmarked police car cut in front of Hughes, causing him to crash. Hughes threatened to kill Gillian if officers approached, forcing them to surrender their vehicle. The pursuit ended shortly before 10 p.m. in the village of Rainow, when Hughes attempted to swerve around a Crossville single-decker bus strategically positioned across the road. He lost control, crashing into a dry stone wall. Surrounded by police, Hughes held an axe over Gillian's head, demanding another escape vehicle and safe passage. Chief Inspector Peter Howes led negotiations, even offering himself as a replacement hostage. After approximately 50 minutes, Hughes's patience snapped. He shouted, "Right, your time's up," and swung the axe at Gillian's head. Howes jumped through the rear window, partially deflecting the blow which still gashed Gillian's forehead. Officer Frank Pell fired a shot that deflected off Hughes's skull. As Hughes struck Howes on the arm with the axe and bit deeply into his arm, Officer Alan Nichols fired 3 more shots. The final bullet entered Hughes's shoulder, passed through his aorta, and killed him instantly. His body fell across Gillian's lap, ending the 3-day ordeal. Hughes was the first person shot dead by Derbyshire Constabulary, and the first prison escapee shot dead by British police in modern times. For his bravery in saving Gillian Moran's life, Peter Howes was awarded the Queen's Commendation for Brave Conduct. Following her rescue, Gillian Moran repeatedly asked about her family's welfare, both before and after receiving medical treatment. Police and medical staff initially delayed sharing the devastating news, but she was soon informed that her parents, husband, and only child had all been murdered. The joint funeral service for Richard and Sarah Moran and Arthur and Amy Minton took place at Brimington Cemetery in Chesterfield on January 21, 1977. Over 100 mourners attended. Gillian and her sister Barbara were driven to the service in a black Daimler with a police escort. To avoid media attention, they were required to switch vehicles midway to the service. The same day as the funerals, a TV journalist interviewed Teresa O'Doherty, Hughes's former girlfriend who had broken up with him shortly before his escape. In this emotional interview, O'Doherty discussed their relationship and her fear upon learning of his escape, stating, "All I can say is I wish to God it had been me and not that family. And I really mean that." Arranging Hughes's funeral fell to the Home Office. Initial plans to bury him at Chesterfield's Boythorpe Cemetery on January 25 sparked fierce protests from local residents. Many vowed to disinter his body if he was buried there, with some residents filling in the prepared grave, chaining the cemetery gates, and posting a protest board signed by scores of residents. These protests forced a last-minute change of plans. Hughes's body was ultimately cremated at the same location where his victim's funeral had been held. In February 1977, Gillian sold the exclusive rights to her story to the Daily Mail. Her account was serialized in 8 parts beginning February 14, 1977. She has never spoken to the media about the events at Pottery Cottage since then. Gillian married Jim Mulqueen, a cousin of her first husband Richard, in December 1978. 2 years later, she gave birth to a daughter. Reports suggest that the emotional burden of supporting Gillian took a toll on Mulqueen, who began drinking heavily. In December 1987, he was jailed for 2 years for threatening a publican with a shotgun. 3 months after the murders, Gillian and Superintendent Peter Hughes met by pre-arrangement at her request. During this meeting, she thanked him for saving her life. In 2017, Alan Nichols, who had died 8 years earlier, was posthumously awarded the Derbyshire Police Federation Bravery Award, which was accepted by members of his family. On March 10, 1977, the Chief Inspector of the Prison Service, Gordon Fowler, published a 57-page report examining the systematic failures that enabled Hughes's escape. The Fowler report severely criticized HMP Leicester's management and staff for failing to follow standard searching procedures after Hughes stole the knife from the prison kitchen. Fowler also criticized the inadequate search methods used before prisoner transfers, recommending mandatory strip searches in all future cases. Further criticism highlighted the lack of information provided by police to the prison service, which prevented proper assessment of Hughes's danger level. The report also noted breakdowns in communication between prison departments that left Hughes' records incomplete. Fowler made 17 separate recommendations for immediate implementation, all of which Home Secretary Merlin Rees accepted, plus 8 more for further review. Despite identifying these systemic issues, no disciplinary action was taken against any staff or management, as the failures were deemed institutional rather than individual. Derbyshire Constabulary faced criticism for focusing their search on routes between Chesterfield and Lancashire, believing Hughes would head in that direction. In a parliamentary debate, on the day the Fowler report was published, Home Secretary Merlin Rees acknowledged that isolated properties in moorland would have been ideal hiding places during the extreme weather. Although police searches had extended to farm buildings in the Eastmoor area, Pottery Cottage wasn't searched because all outward appearances the cottages were occupied by their usual residents and life was continuing normally. The official inquest into the deaths at Pottery Cottage and Hughes's shooting was held in Chesterfield on April 27, 1977. The 2 police officers who fired upon Hughes testified they had done so to protect Gillian. By then promoted to superintendent, Peter Hughes testified that Hughes was in a state of frenzy when shot, and that Gillian would not have been alive today if we had not taken the course of action we did. Home Office pathologist Dr. Alan Usher confirmed all 4 Pottery Cottage victims died from multiple stab wounds inflicted by Hughes, and Hughes died from gunshot wounds. The jury returned unanimous murder verdicts for the Pottery Cottage victims, and a verdict of justifiable homicide in Hughes's case. Both the coroner and jury praised House's bravery, recommending he receive a commendation. The Pottery Cottage murders deeply impacted British law enforcement procedures, particularly regarding prisoner transport and risk assessment. It marked the first time an officer from Derbyshire Constabulary had fatally shot a suspect, and the first instance in which British police had shot dead an escaped, armed and dangerous prisoner. In 1982, Yorkshire Television began production on a film titled The Pottery Cottage Murders, with director David Green and Julie Walters cast as Gillian Moran. However, the project was scrapped in 1983, partly due to public revulsion over the crimes. In 2020, Carol Ann Lee and Peter Hughes published The Pottery Cottage Murders, the first-hand account of a family held hostage, providing the most comprehensive account of the tragedy to date. The case remains one of Britain's most disturbing hostage situations, and has been described as a timetable of terror into mass murder by the contemporary press. The events at Pottery Cottage serve as a stark reminder of systemic failures in criminal justice and the devastating human cost when violent offenders escape custody. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth examination of the Pottery Cottage murders. The systemic failures that allowed William Hughes to escape and the heroic police action that saved Gillian Moran continue to influence criminal justice procedures today. If you found this case as fascinating and disturbing as we did, please take a moment to smash that like button and subscribe to X by X Confidential for more compelling true crime investigations. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our uploads. We're curious to know, do you think the prison system today has adequately addressed the security flaws exposed by the Pottery Cottage tragedy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, remember that understanding history's darkest moments helps us build a safer future.